Good evening. I'm Eric Scott, the Assistant Director of Bands here at the University of Southern Mississippi. And this evening, I'm looking forward to sharing with you the story of a composer named Erwin Schulhoff. And I'm thrilled to be bringing some of his music to life with the assistance of my friends, colleagues, and students here at the USM School of Music. The most common question I've received since announcing my lecture recital is, what is Entartete? Entartete, or forbidden music, was a label that the Nazi government used in an attempt to isolate, discredit, and ban musical works by Jewish composers. After the Nazis seized power in 1933, the works of Felix Mendelssohn and Gustav Mahler were disparaged and condemned, along with works by living composers such as Arnold Schoenberg, Paul Hindemith, and Kurt Weill. As the world moved on from World War II, the voices silenced by the Nazi purge received little performance or scholarship, including Erwin Schulhoff. Unfortunately, there were millions of voices that were lost and stories that still remain untold. So that I hope that through sharing the story of Erwin Schulhoff this evening, that you can see some sort of insight into the experiences and the plight of German artists during this time. Artistic freedom is something that we all take for granted, so I hope that this will serve as a reminder for this vital right that ensures the creation of diverse art in our own country. My goal for this recital is to raise awareness for the topic and encourage other musicians to explore music and perform music from this time in history. I believe in our efforts to study diverse repertoire, we must consider music from our past, even repertoire from our darker moments. Despite not having the notoriety of other composers in the early 20th century, Erwin Schulhoff's life intersects one of the most turbulent times in modern history. And his music is worthy of study because of his blend of traditional and popular concert styles. Schulhoff's musical output was innovative and diverse, and his compositional voice was shaped by some of the most prominent voices in classical music, including Antonin Dvorak, Max Reger, and Claude Debussy. He artfully blended his traditional training with American jazz, political satire, and popular dance music, all of which you'll be hearing this evening. A greater understanding of Schulhoff's music is only possible after a brief examination of the time in which it was written. The Weimar Republic was founded at the end of the First World War amidst political crises, moral confusion, and economic turmoil. The artistic output from this time had flourished as much as it had in Germany for several generations. Although life in Germany changed drastically after the First World War, as the country shifted from an empire to a democracy. And as you can see on the map here, from 1914 to 1923, there were whole countries that were created. And in fact, this shift didn't really occur until 1919. So over the span of 4 years, all of these different countries and democracies were created at the same time. And while this shift produced some beautiful artwork, some of which we'll be exploring this evening, the political upheaval and economic instability exacerbated racial tensions in the Weimar Republic that had occurred under the surface for several decades. Mind you, Jewish citizens had earned equal rights in German-speaking lands just 50 years before, in 1871. All of these factors would create the environment in which the Nazi Party would establish themselves, setting the table for World War II. Dadaism and jazz replaced the romanticism of the old German Empire. Dadaist arts often contain collages of mundane items exhibited as artworks because, in the artist's view, art was not challenged by reality. Rather, reality was challenged by art. Jazz, the American vernacular music, had become increasingly prominent throughout Europe and encompassed ragtime, blues, and various forms of popular music. And composers began to blur the lines between popular music and classical music as jazz made its way from the nightclub to the concert hall. During the First World War, recordings of the original Dixieland Jazz Band and artists like King Oliver cycled throughout Europe. Following the war, the United States occupied part of the Weimar Republic until 1923 and brought with them American popular music. This all helped to reshape the musical landscape in Weimar overnight. The development of the radio, recording technology, and electronic music all had a profound impact on the music that was being created as well. Czechoslovak radio became the earliest public radio broadcaster in continental Europe when it began operations in May of 1923. Radios began broadcasting sports, political addresses, and musical performances much like they do today. And with the increased popularity in radio and advancements in recording technology, composers began composing pieces specifically for the radio, including both the pieces that you'll hear from Schulhoff this evening. Born to a Czech Jewish family in Prague in 1894, Schulhoff's musical talent became evident when he began playing the piano at the age of 3. Schulhoff began his formal musical studies at the Prague Conservatory when he was only 10 years old, where his first role model and teacher was the prominent Czech composer Antonín Dvořák. Despite his initial reservations about Schulhoff, Dvořák encouraged his musical studies in piano and composition. Schulhoff later recounted their first encounter. He said, "Dvořák did not receive us all too accommodatingly. He did not love child prodigies and confronted talent which appeared prematurely without trust. He did not believe that it would produce a sincere musician. He refused to deal with me. Mother, however, did not let herself be so easily disposed of. She didn't want to have a prodigy as a son, but rather sought to justify me in teaching me in music. Dvořák ordered me, perhaps to get rid of the discomfort of the visit, to stand with my forehead against the wall, and he seated himself at the piano. He played a note, said, 'What's this?' I guessed it correctly. He played another note and in another pitch, and again, I correctly named the pitches. Dvořák, obviously taken in at this point, began to play a melody, first of all a simple one, then one with two voices, and finally with chords. I determined the range of the pitches as they followed each other. This game lasted a full 5, perhaps 10 minutes, and finally Dvořák stopped, got up from the piano, and I also turned around from the wall, and he observed me for a while with an examining eye. He was silent. Then he walked over to his desk, opened a drawer, took something out, said, 'Take this,' and handed me a package. And inside were 2 chocolate bars. Thus Dvořák promoted me to the status of a musician. At 15 years old, he traveled to Leipzig, where he met and studied composition with Max Reger, the famed pedagogue in music theory and composition at the Prague Conservatory. Max Reger was a huge advocate for modern music and championed works by Paul Hindemith, Arthur Honegger, and Gustav Mahler. At the age of 18, he left his country and traveled to Paris in hopes of convincing Debussy to accept him as a private composition student. He moved there not knowing if he was actually going to get to study with him or not. And despite his anticipated mentorship with a famed French pedagogue, the tutelage was not what Schulhoff had in mind. Debussy criticized his use of non-traditional voice leadings and the use of parallel fifths, saying, "As long as I'm your teacher, you will learn and preserve the compositional principles certified by century-old practices as correct. Until you leave me and stand compositionally on your own legs, then you can do what you want." Schulhoff and Debussy soon parted ways, although his earlier works, including his 1913 Piano Sonata No. 2, showed influences of his French teacher. Here's a brief excerpt from a remastered recording of Erwin Schulhoff playing his own piece, Piano Sonata No. 2. The trajectory of world history, along with Schulhoff's life, changed drastically in 1914 with the start of the First World War. After being drafted in the Austro-Hungarian army when the war broke out, Schulhoff began his military service in Prague on the Eastern Front. He concluded his military assignment in Hungary, where he suffered a shrapnel wound to his hand and spent the final months of the war in an Italian prisoner of war camp. Schulhoff's creative output continued despite all of this, and in 1918, he entered the Felix Mendelssohn Composition Contest and won, and received his first contract with a publisher. Following the war, in early 1919, Schulhoff moved to Dresden to live with his sister Viola, who was a prominent visual artist. Eager to resume creative activities after the war, artists would gather in public spaces and private homes to discuss topics ranging from art, music, and politics, which resulted in some highly creative and innovative artistic movements. The Schulhoff household became a gathering place for young liberal musicians and painters. All of these collaborations impacted Schulhoff drastically. However, it was George Grosz that introduced him to a new art movement called Dadaism and some of the first recordings of American jazz. He had an extensive jazz collection. And in fact, for the bassist in the room, George Grosz's son, Marty Grosz, was a famous jazz bassist in the United States in the mid-20th century. And so he had an extensive jazz collection very, very early on, and that had a profound impact on Erwin Schulhoff. The visual arts for my lecture this evening, all are works by George Grosz. Dadaism often contained a collage of mundane items exhibited as artwork. Dadaist artists often maintain leftist political views and express discontent with war, nationalism, and violence through media such as collages, poetry, and sculpture. In the aftermath of the First World War, this anti-war, anti-bourgeois message spread throughout Europe, but it was especially well received in war-ravaged Weimar Republic. Here, you have an example by George Grosz, a painting by George Grosz titled Greed, a subtitle Eclipse of the Sun, and it's signaled by the $sign. If you look, there's a $sign eclipsing the sun in the top left corner of the painting. The artwork depicts the greed and the violence in Germany's military, politicians, and industrialists. Grosz depicts the mindless bureaucrats, literally headless suits around the table, around a war general with a industrialist carrying weapons whispering in his ear. The donkey represents the German people wearing the blinders of ignorance. This is the kind of collage style painting that's associated with Dadaism and frequently associated with a lot of Dadaist artworks, not just paintings. And of course, you have the political satire as well. Very similarly, Dadaist music often contained collages of unrelated musical styles, non-musical sound effects like car horns, ratchets, whistles, machines, and musical sound effects like flutter tongues and glissandi, overt political commentary, and musical satire, some of which you're going to be hearing this evening in the music by Erwin Schulhoff in just a moment. Erwin Schulhoff's 1926 work, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, or The Bourgeois Gentleman, is an example of a Dadaist work for chamber winds. It's based on a 1670 play by the French author Molière. It criticizes the idea of social climbing and the bourgeois or the middle class, and also pokes fun at the snobbish aristocracy. According to Molière, a gentleman must be nobly born, meaning that there is no such thing as a bourgeois gentleman. The music consists of an overture and a series of dance scenes in which Schulhoff juxtaposes the high art Western classical music with low art popular dances. In addition, the suite contains brief musical interludes and plenty of elements of musical satire, which you'll hear in just a moment. In early 1926, the director of the National Theater in Prague, Carl Hugo Hiller, needed incidental music for a modern-day setting of Molière's drama. Throughout the original drama, Molière critiques the bourgeoisie and the nobility, both of whom are subject to corruption and driven by superficial desire. Hiller, believing that the sentiment would resonate in modern-day France, or in modern-day Europe, wanted to create a contemporary setting of this theatrical work and set it in Weimar and translated the text from French to German. After the successful production of the play, Schulhoff set the music to a concert suite in the form that you'll hear this evening. And it was premiered via radio broadcast in 1928 with Schulhoff at the piano. The manuscript after that performance was lost and was eventually rediscovered in 1999 in the Museum of Czech Music in Prague, and it was eventually published in just 2006. Now we're going to reset the stage, get a tuning note, and then I will introduce the overture. It's set in the home of Monsieur Jourdain. He's a middle-aged bourgeois. The foolish Jourdain has one aim in life: to rise above his middle-class background and be accepted as an aristocrat. Other main characters in Act 1 include a music master and a dancing master, both who've been hired by Jourdain to teach him in the noble arts of music and dance. Although Jourdain consistently makes a fool of himself, the music and the dancing master continue to coach him to avoid losing their salaries. As the overture begins, the music master is guiding a pupil to compose a serenade, and the dancing master is completing choreography to accompany the music. Jourdain is asleep in the other room, completely unaware of what's going on. The adagio introduction of the overture is the serenade that's being composed. The fast allegro follows the slow introduction and is in sonata allegro form. One can hear the contrast in the song and dance in the two main themes of the allegro, which depict the music master and the dancing master. The six-measure introduction at the beginning of the allegro contains a three-note motive, C, G, C, and you can hear that throughout the entire overture. It's the building block for the accompaniment throughout the movement. The first theme, which is light and nimble, depicts the dancing master and is first heard in the clarinet and the oboe at measure 26. The slower lyrical second theme is it depicts the music master and is scored in the clarinet and the bassoon. Tonight, there will be some brief introductions in between some of the larger movements, so please hold your applause until the conclusion of the entire suite. Here's the overture, followed by the aria. In the stage work, Danse de Tailleurs occurs with Jourdain trying on a custom suit. The master tailor has 4 apprentices, yes, he's hired 4 apprentices and a master tailor, to make a ceremony out of him trying on the suit. The opening motive is the building block for the entire movement. In Danse de Tailleurs, the motives and melodic fragments are each repeated 4 times, depicting each one of the apprentices, while the master tailor does some last-minute measurements. And speaking of measurements, throughout the movement you'll hear ratchet solos, trombone glissandi, ascending and descending lines, all depicting the sound of the tape measure. Dance of the Tailleurs contains a variety of unique color combinations, including English horn, bass clarinet, contrabassoon, and yes, the ratchet, to create an atmosphere of musical satire. Here is Dance of the Tailleurs, followed by the Sicilienne. Throughout The Bourgeois Gentleman, Schulhoff juxtaposes high art Western classical music with low art popular music, including in the Banquet, which consists of a fugato or a short fugue composed in the style of a foxtrot. The beginning of the Banquet is notated ottaguf a la foxtrot, indicating that Schulhoff constructed the ottaguf, or fugato, spelled backwards, in retrograde, saving the statement and the answer that you would normally hear at the beginning of a fugue for the end of the fugue. Here's the subject of the fugue played in the trumpet. Not your average Bach. So he alters the subject through diminution, augmentation, and inversion, which is typical for a fugue. If you listen carefully, you can hear the 4-quarter note initiation of the subject throughout the entire piece. The march immediately follows the Banquet and consists of a progression of melodies in trumpet, oboe, and xylophone to accompany the arrival of the man that Jourdain thinks is the son of the Turkish Sultan. It's really not. It's his daughter's boyfriend, who's dressed as the son of the Turkish Sultan, to try to trick Jourdain into allowing him to marry his daughter. So here is the Banquet and the march, followed by the Napolitana. In the grand final ballet, Jourdain oversees a parade of his teachers to honor the fake, dignified Turkish guest. The movement begins with a brief introduction, followed by the Commedia dell'arte, or the comedy of art, which is a type of theatrical scene that's meant to seem improvised, where actors perform clever pantomimes and acrobatic feats and comical interjections. The theme for the comedy of art is brisk and lively and characterized a lot of shifting accents, and you'll hear it in the trombone, and then it's passed around the rest of the ensemble. The movement contains a diverse collage of different art forms, both traditional and popular, including a tango, a march, a pastoral, a waltz, as philosophers, artists, ballerinas, musicians, and even boxers process in the parade for the dignified Turkish guest. The suite concludes with a return of the theme of the comedy of art, which helps to unify the stylistic changes and bring the work to a close. We hope that you enjoy this final movement of the suite of the Bourgeois Gentleman. Following the end of the suite, we'll take a brief intermission and reset for the second half. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Schulhoff's career as a pianist, composer, and teacher began to flourish. He started his teaching career at the Prague Conservatory in 1923 for piano, and his role in the conservatory expanded in 1929 to include composition. With radio broadcasts spanning from London to Prague, his name became prominent throughout Europe as a respected performer of both traditional and popular music. His concert appearances included critically acclaimed residencies at Paris and in London in 1927, and the premiere of his Concerto for Piano and Orchestra with the Royal Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, with Schulhoff playing at the piano. In the spring of 1933, the Nazi Party presented a series of exhibits called Degenerate Art, with the premise of denouncing and stigmatizing most modern works. Despite attempts to clarify what was classified as degenerate art, the regime's definition remained unclear until the mid-1930s, when he began targeting works specifically by Jewish artists. Music was also a target in the assault on artistic freedoms, as the Nazi Party leaders began a campaign to align politics, society, culture, and art with Nazi ideology. Music that upheld the standards of conventional beauty and conveyed the values of militarism, racial purity, and heroism were exalted. Works depicting the horrors of war, corruption, and brutality experienced in the regime were explicitly forbidden. The party disparaged well-known Jewish composers Felix Mendelssohn, Gustav Mahler, and Arnold Schoenberg, citing them all as anti-German. While fellow composers Paul Hindemith, Kurt Weill, and Ernst Krenek escaped persecution and immigrated to the United States, Erwin Schulhoff relocated his family to his homeland of Czechoslovakia. As the Nazi army invaded Czechoslovakia, they continued their assault on artistic freedoms. In the Greater German Reich, the government continued to exert complete control over every avenue of free thought, from press, radio, and cinema to theater, churches, and even academic institutions. This control was executed through the Reich Chamber of Culture, which oversaw the production of all arts, including film, theater, and music in Nazi-controlled lands. By the late 1930s, membership in the Reich Chamber of Culture was required for employment in professional ensembles and academic institutions. Artists wishing to become members were required to prove their Aryan ancestry. Because Erwin Schulhoff couldn't prove his Aryan ancestry, he was ineligible for membership, and thus he lost his decade-long teaching post at the Prague Conservatory. After losing employment at the Prague Conservatory, Schulhoff feared capture and began the immigration process. Although other composers, such as Arnold Schoenberg and Paul Hindemith, were able to expedite their immigration process due to their established international reputations, Schulhoff's paperwork was denied, and after losing employment, his financial means were limited. He eventually began the process of immigrating to the Soviet Union. To generate income and to support his family, Schulhoff began producing many popular jazz pieces for the radio and began using several different pseudonyms for his engagements. Unfortunately, this was extremely common for Jewish artists at the time to pick an Aryan-sounding name just so they could continue their livelihood and continue making art. In 1941, Schulhoff received his Soviet citizenship for his family and began the process of immigrating, but his immigration status came too late. As Schulhoff made plans to leave, Hitler violated the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and invaded on June 22, 1941, making it impossible for Schulhoff to leave Czechoslovakia. Despite having his petition for citizenship approved, he was arrested and imprisoned the next day after the invasion, before he could escape. Schulhoff was initially held in the Prague YMCA before being deported to the concentration camp in Wolfsburg, Bavaria. While fellow Czech composers Pavel Haas, Gideon Klein, and Victor Ullmann, all of whom are worthy of study, and music is certainly worth studying as well, those composers were arrested for their Jewish ethnicity. Schulhoff was placed in a camp specifically for Soviet citizens. Despite his imprisonment, Schulhoff continued to compose, including piano sketches of his Seventh Symphony while being detained in Prague, and sketches of his Eighth Symphony while being imprisoned in Wolfsburg. Before his work could be complete, Schulhoff caught tuberculosis and died August 28, 1942. He was buried in a straw bag in an unmarked grave outside of Wolfsburg concentration camp. When Erwin Schulhoff was approved for immigration, he shipped much of his music to the Soviet Union, allowing his compositions to survive the Nazi purge. Diplomacy after the end of the Cold War allowed further research into music from this time period. And with the 50th anniversary of the Second World War, just a few years later, music from the Weimar Republic saw a resurgence in scholarship. And today, through scholarship and research, the music from composers like Erwin Schulhoff are being performed again for the first time in several generations. Schulhoff's musical legacy includes 6 complete symphonies, an opera, pieces, chamber pieces for solo violin, flute, bassoon, a sextet for winds and piano, a number of string quartets, and several works for piano, and a variety of pieces that are traditionally written and influenced by popular music. One of his most valuable contributions was in the realm of jazz-influenced concert works. Arguably, no other European composer in the 1920s dedicated himself more to incorporating jazz in concert works than Erwin Schulhoff. His involvement in jazz for the decades that followed World War I attests to his appreciation for jazz as a musical aesthetic and a rebellious cultural movement. Mind you, there was a rebellious cultural movement with associated with jazz here in the United States. Hindemith and Milhaud experimented with jazz in concert works by 1922 and 1923. However, Schulhoff incorporated elements in his works as early as 1919 upon his return from the war. Schulhoff credited himself with the creation of what he called art jazz. He said, "As you see, I was the first to succeed with art jazz. Compare the dates of origin and you'll discover that the other composers followed me. I certainly admit that I've refrained from prospering from this, but for me, the fact that I still hold the lead in this direction is enough for me." Here's a recording of Tango from 5 jazz etudes, first written in 1919 for piano and later arranged for chamber ensemble. This work is performed by an ensemble called the Ebony Band, and the Ebony Band is a wonderful resource. They have dedicated a lot of their time and energy over the past several decades in creating recordings of works from this time period. So if you're interested in finding out more about music from this time period, the Ebony Band is a great resource to check out. Here is Tango from 5 jazz etudes. Erwin Schulhoff's 1930 work, Hot Sonata, for saxophone and piano, was among one of the first compositions to elevate the jazz saxophone from the Weimar nightclubs to the concert halls. In fact, this sonata is one of the first saxophone sonatas, period, let alone one for jazz. It exemplifies Schulhoff's skill in utilizing American jazz in concert works. The Berlin Radio commissioned the work, which received its premiere by American saxophonist Billy Barton, with Schulhoff playing at the piano. Barton created one of the first swing bands in the Weimar Republic and had an exceptional high register for the time. Schulhoff utilizes the high register in a very purposeful manner in this piece. As Schulhoff noted, only musicians like Barton can play my sonata. The work incorporates a jazz vernacular, including rhythmic grooves, syncopation, jazz harmonies, and scales, including the blues and the whole tone scale, into a traditional form of the sonata. In 2002, composer Richard Rodney Bennett transcribed Hot Sonata for orchestral winds, percussion, and string bass in the version that you'll be hearing tonight. The first movement is constructed in ternary form with two contrasting themes. And again, rhythm plays a very critical role in the construction of the movement, particularly in drawing contrast to the smooth, lyrical, flowing nature of the first theme and the biting rhythms of the second. Titled Vivo, the second movement is upbeat and contains more musical dialogue between the soloist and the ensemble, and even includes a shout chorus in the ensemble. The movement is constructed in a modified strophic form, which is a popular musical form, and consists of two themes. The melodic material utilizes the blues scale. Marked lament, but very grotesque. The third movement is slow and expressive lyrical blues ballad, and it has some grit to it. You probably haven't been to a Weimar nightclub playing jazz, but you've probably been to one in New Orleans. It's similar. The smears and the staccatos in the primary theme stand out in contrast to the staccato notes in the accompaniment. The theme alternates in varying episodes, again, similar to a verse-refrain. And the final statement of the primary theme includes a very more elaborate improvisatory feel in the saxophone. And speaking of improvisation, there is no improvisation in the saxophone solo. It sounds improvised, but it's all written down. The fourth movement is a driving finale in ternary form, and it's constructed in a 16-bar phrases. The movement contains melodic material indicative of the blues scale and uses extensive syncopation and cross rhythms. There's a lot of rhythmic grooves in this last movement. Schulhoff creates thematic unity in the sonata by incorporating the primary theme of the first movement in the middle of the last movement, which again is a very classical idea. The driving rhythms return from the slower section to bring the work to a climatic ending. If you'd like to know more about Entartete Musik, feel free to check out some of these resources here. You can scan the QR code. The QR code is also on the back of the program. For those who are joining us virtually, you can also check out the virtual program, and that will have a QR code for the links as well. One thing that I would like to point out, at least for the musicians in the room, the Forbidden Music link at the very top, if you go there, they have a search engine that you can go through and you can search specific pieces for particular instruments. So if you want to know a flute piece, a bassoon piece, viola, various pieces of chamber works, woodwind quintets, string quartets, other things, that's a wonderful, wonderful resource. And a lot of these pieces are either IMSLP, or if you have to purchase them, they go towards organizations that help with scholarship and research in this area. So it's money well spent. And again, of course, you're more than welcome to ask me questions as well. I'd like to welcome our special guests that have joined us this evening from the synagogue in Hattiesburg. I would like to especially thank Nick and Rachel Serraldo for extending the welcome to those. Welcome to the School of Music. Thank you for joining us this evening. As many of you know, this is a culminating event for my DMA at Northwestern. I will not be Dr. Scott after this evening, but it's going to be a huge step in that direction, and I'm immensely grateful for a lot of people in this room that have helped to make that necessary. First off, my wonderful students and colleagues, some are making music with me today, some are here to support in the audience. Thank you so much for making this a wonderful, wonderful home here since I arrived last year. To my family, thank you so much for all your unconditional love and support and helping me every step of the way from being, from starting beginning bands to having this crazy idea of going off to grad school and moving all over the place and doing all the things. You were there to support me, and I couldn't do this without you. I love you guys, and thank you so much. To Dr. Thompson, my DMA conducting teacher, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for seeing the potential in me that I didn't always see in myself, and for continuing to push me and motivate me to become the best version of myself that I can be. To Dr. Vondran, thank you so much for your mentorship throughout my DMA and for helping to edit my document. For Professor Steve Davis, my master's teacher, you are one of the most passionate musicians and teachers that I've ever met in my life, and have had such an impact on me since studying with you, and I hope that I can have the same kind of impact on my students that you've had on me. Thank you so much. And last and certainly not least, I'd like to thank Noah. Thank you so much for your patience and your unwavering support through all of this. There's been a lot of Schulhoff going on in our household over the past couple of months, as you could probably imagine. Both me talking about Schulhoff, him reading Schulhoff, him playing Schulhoff, me conducting Schulhoff. There's a lot of Schulhoff. So I can't imagine a better person to be on this journey with. Thank you so much, and I love you. At this time, we're going to take a quick shift of scenery here, move up the screen. They're going to play a few notes. We'll get a tuning note, and then I'll introduce our soloist.